Welcome to Negotiation with Alice, your negotiation podcast. Everything that you do where you need to get on the same page with someone else is a negotiation. So whether you have to negotiate a contract with someone, or you simply need your boss to sign off on that program that you'd like to implement, or you want to figure out how to rebalance the chore structure in your home, or talk about what vacation you want to go on. All of these things are negotiations. So in my podcast, we go over both personal and professional conversations, which all are considered negotiation, and I will give you tips on how to come out ahead. Welcome to the show. Welcome to another exciting episode of Negotiation with Alice. Today, I've got guest Kira Shishkin here with us. Hi, Kira.
Hi, Alice. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Kira, you are calling in from Chicago, and I know that I'm very excited to have you because you've started several companies and you've been very successful. I'd love for you to share with the audience sort of like your background.
I would be delighted. Well, thank you for having me. I am joining from Chicago today. My name is Kira Shishkin, and I'm the CEO and founder of l.informed.now, which is currently the passion and the main venture that I'm focused on, which is making news reading for everyday people worthwhile again, because a lot of that has become very noisy over the years, especially in North America. Prior to this, I have a pretty international background. I grew up in Ukraine and Israel before coming to the States as a first generation or generation zero immigrant. And I started 3 companies in the past. This is kind of my 4th rodeo. And I'm really excited about what we're doing now.
That is fantastic. And I'm sure that when you are starting all these companies, there's always a lot of negotiation to be had, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can you
I
give
feel
us
like
Go ahead.
there are almost 3 levels that we identify, which is negotiating with your team, whether that's your employees, your co-founders, your partners. Then the second layer is negotiating with your partners, right? These are external to your team. These are folks that are enabling your services, enabling what you're able to do. Obviously, it looks different from different industries, but for us, a lot of that is other technology partners. And I think the third is you're always negotiating with your customer, right? It can look in very subtle ways, but I think that's also a negotiation dance that is played. And so there's negotiation all around.
Also, do you end up also negotiating with yourself a lot?
Oh, yeah. I feel like there's so much of that. I don't know if I would call that negotiation because it's more like my own soul searching. But in some ways, negotiation is a soul searching experience. So maybe it's not too different.
So one of the things that I like to talk about when we negotiate is really the preparation phase, because to me, that is critical. And if people miss that or skip that stage, they are really putting themselves at a disadvantage. And I would love to talk a little bit, Kira, about how do you prepare for negotiations? And I understand you've got different ones. So I'm sure, depending on who you're negotiating with, your preparations might look different. But let's say, I don't know, let's just pick outside partners, right? Just for one, as a starter. How do you prepare for those kinds of negotiations? What do you look for? What are you researching?
Absolutely. I feel like coming prepared to negotiation is a like a is a benchmark. Like you have to do it. You can't just show up expecting you gotta figure everything out on the fly. It's going to prolong the process. It might frustrate the other party, especially if they are the ones coming prepared to speak with you. And I think coming prepared is a show of respect. And if you're going to have a successful negotiation, you need to come with an abundance of respect for the other party. And so many things that I think can be prepared, researched ahead of time. If you're bringing that sort of diligence into the conversation of like, oh, I haven't done my reading about you, to me, I would always interpret that as a show of disrespect for my time, as a disrespect for kind of like what we were coming with. And so I always try to come prepared on obviously what the partner's offerings are. And if I'm going to be making asks that are outside of that, I want to come prepared with a sense of, have they ever tried offering this? Have they ever made exceptions of this sort with other partners, with other sort of clients or partners that they've served? And so it's not just the basic research of like who am I talking to, but also the history of their decisions. Have they in the past played with, or worked with a partner in our industry, or are we going to be the first from our industry kind of making that headway? Have they in the past tried going down the path of offering the specific service that we're asking for? Is this a tried and failed, or is this a tried and postponed, or is this a tried and successful operation for them where there is a lot of precedent for them to say yes? So it's sort of a mix of getting to know them as a partner from their kind of entity perspective, but also the history of their decisions as much as they can be observable in terms of what have they done in the past, in terms of servicing, partnering with companies like us to see if their asks we're making are reasonable in the first place.
Now, how much of that information, right, you're talking about, their past history, who they partner with, who they've invested with, how much of that is easily accessible versus sort of like they might be investing or doing something sort of like behind the scenes? Like, is it fairly easy to research that, or is a lot of that hidden and you have to go digging around or trying to find connections so that you can interview them to get that information?
Yeah, it's a very fair question because so much of it is not immediately visible, and it also depends on the industry, right? There's some industries that are a lot more, promotional of their past efforts, promotional of their partnerships, big logo slides, big logo pages, and some are a bit more, logo shy. I find that almost in every industry there is at least some level of a testimonial or a, so to speak, you know display of who have we worked with in the past, whether that's on a website or on a pitch material or any introductory materials of that kind. What I find can be really helpful, and doesn't necessarily always have to be a a long interview conversation, is looking at those logos, discovering what industries do they represent, what are the needs that they potentially have, and if there is a way to reach that person through a contact, reaching them, emailing them, and just saying, hey, just a quick question. I don't necessarily need to get on a call with you. How was your experience with XYZ? Right? Here's a brief background. It could be a paragraph long outreach, and you can send it to multiple of the past clients and experience that sort of immediate feedback. Do they respond? If they respond, are they speaking positively? Are they kind of standoffish? All of these things are signals, and not all that is easily available, but it is quite easy to, I find at least, get that ball rolling and send out those pigeons, and you'll see who comes back.
So I'm curious, you're talking about pitches. Are these cold pitches, warm pitches? Like, how well do you know them, if at all?
Yeah, I find that most of the partners that we wind up negotiating with are these very high intention, uh, you know, rather high intention introductions where we are either seeking them out or they have pitched to us, and we see that there's agreement. There's like, wow, this is exactly what we need to enrich our technology stack or enrich our overall kind of research stack or just in any ways make our business more successful. So they tend to be more on the high intention front, right? Either made through introductions or we would seek them out and discover them. There are a couple of times, we've had two partners this year that we brought, one on the marketing side and one on the kind of core technology side, that actually was an inbound pitch that we received, reviewed, and said, wow, this is very exciting. We want to have those conversations. I mean, obviously there is some leverage that you have when you're being the one reached out to,
Right.
but I would say that leverage never really goes away. If there's mutual interest, even when you're the one reaching out. Just because you're reaching out doesn't mean, you are a beggar, not a chooser. You can still, you can still communicate expectations. You can still set boundaries of what value you bring to the partnership and what you care about. And so we never kind of let go of our feeling of leverage, even when we are on the outreach side.
Now, I'd love to hear, whenever anyone is starting a negotiation, whether it's trying to get a job or whether it's trying to find partners, really any kind, a lot of times they run into gatekeepers, right? And for my audience, gatekeepers are people who don't want to let you in to be able to negotiate with a person of authority, right? And so what are some of the tactics or strategies that you've been able to employ if you've ever run into gatekeepers where you're trying to get in touch with someone and someone is blocking you from reaching them?
I love that. I feel like one of the most obvious examples of that is recruiters, right? If you are someone who's seeking a job and you want to talk to the hiring manager, but in the process, a bureaucratic corporate process, for example, there's a recruiter who is saying, oh, I'm going to be the gatekeeper and I will pass on information back and forth. To me, that is still a negotiation. It becomes just an agentic negotiation, right? Where you are negotiating through an agent. It certainly changes the nature of things, but I think the bottom line of discovery of what the other person values and communicating in a transparent way what you value, to me, is still the same kind of core process. You're ultimately, understanding the other side's needs, communicating your needs, building trust in the process, right? You never want to be, to me, the ability to negotiate rests on the ability to trust each other. If the two parties cannot trust each other, you can't really negotiate. And so to me, working through an agent, in that case, a recruiter in an employment scenario, isn't that different, right? It maybe makes it more delayed, makes it more frustrating, makes it slower. But the core, tenets of understanding the other side as well as you can, communicating yourself transparently and building trust is still the same, even if it's being mediated through an agent.
So I'm curious because, I've said this to many people that if you are working through an agent, a lot of times you have to actually coach them on how to negotiate in your best interest because you are your own expert, and the person who's the agent, the recruiter, whoever they are, or it could be even, for example, if you're trying to sell some software to somebody in a company and they say, well, let me go run it by my boss. They may not be able to pitch your product as well as you can. And so sometimes you just have to coach them through the negotiation or educate them in ways that they can frame the negotiation, right? So that they are presenting you in the best light. Have you come across that where you've had to do some coaching so you make sure they pitch it properly?
Absolutely. I mean, and it is a hard skill to teach. It is a very, you can't just watch a YouTube video on negotiations and immediately understand. There's a lot of practice. There's almost like a bit of an apprenticeship model when you are watching other people do it and you practice it yourself. It's very hard to pick this up without learning by doing. And so in those moments when you're exchanging emails, for example, with a recruiter, and you're saying, hey, can you propose these terms instead of these other terms as an employee, for example, it's very challenging to have to teach them how to keep your best interest in mind. I think moments of trying to simplify, like what is the one thing that matters most and what are you willing to trade, can become a moment of simplicity, saying, hey, I know you guys want me to start sooner, right? Or maybe another way of saying it, I know there's no flexibility on the pay, which is super important to me, but I know you may have flexibility on a start date, right? Like I would be very happy to start 2 months later, right? Having this offer, this opportunity, if there's flexibility on that, right? So you're some sort of coaching them into what are the two tokens that you're willing to trade. You can trade for example, reduced salary, which matters to them. But for example, you want to take 2 months off and start later on, which to them very often is not as important, and depending on when their staffing needs are. But 2 months of job security in distance and having ability to kind of be in this happy place can be really valuable. And so you're essentially coaching your agent, saying there's a token I'm willing to sacrifice if you can trade this other token. And that is often, that often lands well because it's very simple. We're just trading these two tokens. But to get to the simplicity, you need to first have an understanding of what they care about, what they don't care about, and have the trust to propose kind of a token trade.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic way to negotiate, right? Because not everyone wants the same thing, even though you're in the same negotiation, negotiating for some scenario, the things that people want in that scenario are different. So let's go back to what we were talking about earlier. And when you're, in early negotiations and you're doing a lot of research on the people that you're about to go into negotiations with, how have you learned what the other party's interests are, right? When you are doing the research, like, do you interview them or do you find out information some other way, or both, really?
Yeah, it's funny because I don't believe that there are some kind of like magic words or tricks, that work better than just transparently asking, like, what matters to you most in this conversation? What matters to you most in this partnership? What, if you were to say, is it the start time? If we kind of stick with the employment example, is it the salary? Is it the benefits? Is it paid time off? Is it something else? Right? Like, just tell me what do you care about the most? And I feel like some of the most effective ways of having that conversation are some of the simplest and most transparent, of just essentially saying, like, tell me what you care about, right? And through that process, you get to disclose yourself and learn the other side what they're willing to trade. And one of the things that I found, pretty consistently, is that when you understand the other side's needs and goals, it increases, and each side understands mutually, it increases the overall pie, right? And I think the process of negotiation very often isn't just splitting a pie that exists 50-50, but it's finding ways to grow the pie and getting 60-60, right? And getting a little bit more for both. But growing the pie requires trust, and growing the pie requires this understanding of, what is, what do you care about? Without that, it's almost impossible to have negotiation. You're just guessing. And I've never been in a successful negotiation where people are just guessing each other's needs.
Right, right. So talk about, since you've been creating these different companies, obviously you have a lot of experience negotiating, but I'm sure there was a time when you're not quite the expert that you are now. And so talk a bit about your journey in becoming a better negotiator, aside from, like, okay, just do it every day, because that's obviously the way to get better. But what other things have helped you become a stronger negotiator?
Yeah. I mean, I think my journey has been viewing negotiation in a movie type way, where it's this like intense moment in a room and it's this theatrical argument of people kind of like fighting with each other. And I think that's one of the most, incorrect and toxic conceptions of negotiating, because it undermines the point. But it is the most accessible image in our minds when we think of negotiating. We think of these like heated rooms, of people arguing. And it's definitely been an evolution for me, because I come from Eastern Europe, where there's a lot of, strong-headed culture in many ways, of kind of like fighting is pretty normalized. And coming to the United States, I've become a little softer, a bit more gentle in many ways, and finding ways to leverage silence, finding ways to leverage kind of like calm conversations that don't even look like negotiations on the surface, but they are, because we are, in a process of trading and figuring out what we can exchange. So to me, I think calmer negotiations that aren't even framed or even using the word negotiations, but just saying, let's have a conversation, let's discuss, let's explore, using different, much less hostile, much more gentle vocabulary, I think has been very important. The transparency piece, cannot stress that enough, is you have to have an honest conversation. You cannot you cannot be deceitful in negotiation, because when you are, it jeopardizes the whole thing, and you're going to likely walk away with no deal for either parties, which is going to be a net negative for both sides. So I think my journey has been towards more gentleness, more softness, and more listening. I think more than ever, instead of coming in and sort of announcing what do you want, what do you care about, but coming in with a keen curiosity for how can I learn about the other side? How can I learn about what matters to them? And how can I do that in a way that is delightful, that is pleasant, so that it's not some sort of a painful experience? Because if negotiating is a painful experience, you're not really going to get to the other side.
So you mentioned you are originally from Ukraine. How old were you when you came to the United States? Just so I have an idea of, like, like the how young you were when you moved over here.
Yeah, well, I moved one time before coming to the US. And so I kind of spent my whole childhood in Ukraine. my whole like teenagehood, young adulthood in Israel. And then I come to the United States for like my early mid 20s, and I've been spending my kind of adulthood here ever since.
So you basically have three cultures.
I would say there's a fourth that I'm less excited about these days because it's Russian, and my parents are first and second generation immigrants from Russia to Ukraine, and so I grew up speaking Russian alongside Ukrainian, and I have a lot of those kind of like Russian cultural imprints. But it's a culture that I'm a lot less associated with these days because growing up Ukrainian, it's a bit of a hard time to marry both these days in one identity.
Right. So, it's an obvious question to ask you because you've got all these cultures. Let's talk a little bit about cross-cultural negotiations, right? Like, because you have all of these different cultures in your background, and as you mentioned earlier, right, you said, okay, so my way of being when I was, coming from Eastern Europe was a little bit harsher, a little bit stricter, and you've softened up a bit. So talk about what it's like when you have different cultures who negotiate differently. They've got their cultural biases, cultural differences, and when you show up and people are maybe like, just for an example, in Japan, if you're direct, you're probably going to lose a negotiation, right? Everything is unspoken, everything is indirect. And it's really like offensive to them if you just flat out say, okay, let's just make the deal. Like, why don't we in the very first meeting? Because they're like, we haven't even built trust yet. I don't even know who you are yet. So talk a bit about, from your perspective of being around all these different cultures and growing up in different cultures, what that's like in terms of negotiating cross-culturally.
Totally. And I love that you bring up the Japan example because I was just in Japan 4 months out of this past year and spent a lot of time getting to know this very different way of communicating, very different way of negotiating. And frankly, I don't think the rules of negotiation are any different. To me, it's the trust, the understanding, the transparency, all those things are universally valued. To me, it's a lot more around the form and the communication style of how those same values are packaged and sort of exchanged and communicated. So to me, I think Japan is a great example. It is still the same thing. It's about trust building. It's about building a relationship. It's about also, building a confidence and honesty with each other. But it is done in a much more indirect way rather than, there's a lot more withheld information. There's a lot more silence. There's a lot more kind of unspoken things. To me, it's a communication difference. It is not a negotiation practice difference. And I like to distinguish those two because ultimately negotiation is a pretty universal kind of, it's a universal process. It's only the wrapping around it that changes across cultures. For example, Israeli communicators are very loud, very boisterous, a bit more direct. And there's a bit more of it's a bit of a galvanizing experience, not necessarily in a negative way, but it's very lively, right? Israeli negotiations are very lively, or they can be. Japanese are essentially the polar opposite. But to me, they're all after the same goal, right? Trust, honesty, transparency, understanding of each other, just a different language and cultural communication barrier. And to me, you have to play the game of the other side. At least you have to signal honoring that game if you're going to be successful, right? If we're negotiating with your Japanese partner, we are going to be trying our best, right, to bow down literally to their format. And very often, just the effort of doing that will go a really long way. Even if you can't internalize all the cultural practice of Japan, if you can at least show the effort, that will do wonders.
So in your preparation, are you studying sort of like the different communication methods of the different cultures?
Yes, I try to, right? So getting to know kind of what I mentioned earlier, getting to know the entity is very much getting to know, what they do, how they do it, what are they known for, what are the values that they are familiar with, and if they come from a different culture, either the founding team, the owner, or the management, or the people I'll be negotiating with come from a different culture, I will try to, not not excessively, but I'll try to lean into speaking their language, metaphorically, not literally speaking their language.
Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting how you mentioned, some cultures are more boisterous and lively, and some cultures are more demure. And I know as a mediator, when I'm and this is not even cross culturally, but I know that sometimes people feel like they're being yelled at when in fact they're not. It's just the perspective, right? That's just how they feel. And then they start to be in a position where they can't really think straight anymore because they feel like they're under attack. So I'm
Yeah,
curious if you've ever experienced a situation where someone is coming from one culture where they're really boisterous and negotiating with a culture that's maybe not as, maybe even American culture, right? Where it starts to, the communication breaks down because of the fact that someone is feeling like attacked because it's too lively or it's too direct or it's too loud, right? That sort of thing.
totally. And also, I feel like for some of the most important negotiations, it isn't just that you're negotiating 100% of the time. You have to lean into talking about other things, right? Talking about the kids, or having any sort of small talk, or maybe even meeting, in the middle. If, for example, it's a multi-round negotiation, right, where it's going to be many meetings with many stakeholders, meeting in the middle of that, that is just for lunch, that is not, not designed to push the negotiation forward, but designed to push the relationship forward. And I feel like that is probably one of the best ways to sort of like diffuse and to help bond with the other party, instead of always just, we're only here to negotiate. No, we're here to build a relationship, and the negotiation is going to be part of that relationship. But making that time to build those bridges, especially in extended and high priority negotiations, is really important. And to me, that's the best way to bring together the loud Israeli and the quiet Japanese to the same table. And I've sort of done that and been part of those negotiations over the last couple of months, being in Japan, of like making the time to bond, making the time to small talk, and talking not just about the negotiation all the time. To me, that is probably one of the best ways to diffuse and bond these culturally stark differences.
I love that you bring that up, right? Because really, people do business with people who they like and trust. So, you're talking a bit about trust earlier, right? And building that trust. But then you want to find like places where we have commonalities. Oh, we both have kids that are in high school, right? Or we both like soccer or football or whatever it is. And so once you start to build that bond, as you mentioned, and you decide, oh, we actually like one another, it really starts to gel, right? Talk a bit more about how, like when you've been in negotiations, how that moment of gelling, how did it like affect the negotiation after that bonding moment?
Yeah, it eases, it sort of like relaxes the overall temperature in the room. It makes people open up, which yields then to learning more about them, learning what they value, what they don't value, which is ultimately the goal, right? It's almost like I view this bonding and becoming more human as a way to unleash the honesty and transparency that we need to learn about each other's needs. Because sometimes a party can come into negotiation and be, maybe they're less mature as a negotiator, maybe they have other reasons to be kind of sensitive about information, maybe they've received mixed signals from their leadership, and so they're coming in and they feel hesitant to share what matters to them, which to a more experienced counterparty is going to say, well, wow, this is going to take some warming up to, because we cannot negotiate without revealing what matters to you. And so that's when you are investing in, wining, dining, spending time together, small talking, and kind of almost guiding the conversation away from the sensitive negotiation more towards relationship, to make them more comfortable sharing what they care about, because that is a right, like that is a non-negotiable, right? Being transparent with what you care about is an inevitable disclosure without which we cannot proceed. And so people warm up, people get more comfortable, people get more relaxed, because they can see the human on the other side and not just a negotiating counterpart.
And also, once you both decide that you like one another, then you also have this emotional desire to get the deal done, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a more willingness to put in the effort, because the effort is now not sort of, you're not expiring effort for somebody you don't like. You are almost like helping a friend, right? It feels better to put effort in once you like the person. And effort is frequently what's needed, what's missing. The effort to listen, the effort to make a compromise, the effort to consider something that previously for a stranger would be inconsiderable.
Right, exactly. Like you're willing to go the extra mile.
Yeah.
Now, you're talking about whining and dining. You're talking about having, like just separate conversations that aren't necessarily negotiation driven in order to build that relationship, right? And so as you spend that time together, one of the things I like to talk about in negotiation is factoring in time as a strategic method for the negotiation, right? In many different ways. Time can be used in many different ways. It can be used in real time in negotiations, but also in your instance, if you're like sort of courting one another, getting to know each other. So now we've spent days or weeks together, right? So talk about how that investment of time. So this is separate from like our trust and likability, just the
Yeah.
investment that I've put in now. Let's say I've met with you 10 times already. We haven't done the deal yet, but now I'm so invested that it's going to tip the negotiation scales, right?
Certainly. I feel like, two reactions on that is, one is so much of the negotiation is actually about the pre-negotiation, right? The preempting of the negotiation, which is going to be the kind of solutioning stage. Before you're in a solutioning stage of like brainstorming, like what can we trade and how, building that base ahead of time is just going to simplify that ultimate like solutioning stage. And so I wouldn't think of these whining and dining kind of phase as a separate process. It is fully a core part of the negotiation process. You are just conducting it in a different way. Say, for example, you don't go on that dinner date with your counterparty ahead of time. You're going to probably need multiple sessions down the line to actually align on the solutioning. Versus you do invest that time, it may actually cut down that ultimate meeting into a 20-minute call of saying, yeah, we agree, we're aligned, we have the trust, we understand. And so I don't think of them as like a separate time budget, but it's the same process, just done, in different framing, in a framing of relationship first. And, I think it really matters because very likely if it's a partnership that matters, right? Because generally, I don't think you should be doing a lot of negotiation with relationships and partners that don't matter. Right? If it's a small thing, it's not worth negotiating. But if it's a big transaction, a big relationship, a big partnership, it's likely that it's not your last negotiation. And when you are coming into it with a perspective of we just need to get a solution and negotiate this piece, you are walking away maybe with a solution, maybe with a deal you like, but not with a precedent or a relationship to do it again down the line. Next quarter, next year, you might wind up in a situation where you have to negotiate with the same party again. When you have the relationship, it can be again a 20-minute call. When you've kind of fast forwarded, rushed that initial stage, that initial negotiation, you're going to have to essentially redouble those efforts. You're going to have to restart from the beginning. And there is no shortcut, right? Like it requires this relationship to be built. And so I think one of the quotes I really like, and I think it's kind of funny, it's kind of like dad joke funny. It's not really that funny, but it's something like 3 hours of hard work can save you 15 minutes of preparation. And I think it's kind of like a quirky way of putting it is like, you just have to keep in mind that like a little bit of upfront preparation, or in our case, a bit of upfront whining and dining, will save you many meetings down the line. And you have to just think about it that way. And initially saying, oh, I don't have time to do this. I don't have time to take this kind of small talk meeting. But down the line, you're going to be paying for this with 3 additional hours of Zoom calls with many parties, their lawyers, your lawyers, etc. And it's just like, it's definitely a worthwhile investment, right? Those 3 hours of hard work down the line are not, are worth taking the 15-minute upfront meeting. And
That's
so,
almost, yeah, it's almost like going slow to go fast.
yeah.
Right. And so it sounds like that's a really good strategy for you. If you're like, let me just slow down, let's just get to know each other a little bit, let's build the trust. And then all of the negotiations after that go a lot faster.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to clear the tracks for the train to go at full speed. And you say, I don't have time to clear the tracks. I don't have time for it. You're going to get on that train together and you're going to keep, you're going to have a very shaky ride. And at some point you might have to still go and clear the tracks. But it will, I think relationship also has this compounding value where the longer you know each other, the more trust builds naturally onto itself. If you don't betray each other, if you don't hurt each other in the process, just having a relationship age, like fine wine over the years, is going to have this like goodwill value that you'll be glad you started earlier versus now you've skipped that relationship building in that beginning of a period. Now it's a year later or a few years later and you have to redo the negotiation. You could have been building goodwill all those 3 years because you took those meetings, you invested that upfront effort, and you've exchanged those smiles. Now you are starting from zero. You are starting again. You could have had 3 years of goodwill relationship just building on its own, like in a barrel, like just like wine.
Right, right. And also, like, so back to the timing factor. So let's say that you and I, we didn't know each other, then we start negotiating, right? So the walk away factor, the ability for me to or you to walk away from the deal, I feel like becomes incrementally more difficult the longer we've negotiated or spent time together. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how that's played out for you?
This the classic sunk cost fallacy, right? When you are putting in the effort into something, you naturally, as a human, it's a very human thing that we all do. You want to see it come to fruition, and so it's a great way of almost committing to making a deal from the very beginning by inviting the other party to spend the time. Also committing your own time and saying, "Hey, we're in this together. We are, we're sunking the effort. We are investing this time, we're becoming increasingly more bought into doing some kind of a deal." And so the deal becomes more inevitable. The terms of the deal are going to be hammered out, but the deal itself becomes a lot more inevitable as you spend more and more time, as you decide to invest more and more time in each other. And so I definitely find that to be pretty, subtle but important. The sunk cost fallacy works in our favor there, hopefully from both sides.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I find to be true. Just human beings don't want to walk away from something that they have spent so much effort and energy, right? Like just invested in that. And so then it becomes, as you mentioned, more and more important to get the deal done because people don't want to just walk away from something that they've spent 20 hours trying to, work the deal up. So I think that's a really good strategy. Not necessarily that you want to aim for that, but if you find that you've spent a lot of time with people already, it's easier to try to maneuver later on in the stage, right? Because if you try to make these big maneuvers early, I can just be like, sorry, Kira, but like, I'm not okay with this, I'm going to walk away. But if we've been doing this talks for a long time, it's much harder for me to walk away when you like make a big ask of me.
Yeah, yeah, and you're more likely to consider it because now we're friends. To me, it's like the relationship creates this fabric for multi negotiations, for more friendly negotiations, for everything. And so, to me, it's almost if we were to simplify it, the art of negotiating is the art of relationship building with a few hard conversations along the way. But it is ultimately all that, right? It's ultimately building trust, building a relationship, and when you have that foundation and you have that, you can put all kinds of things, stack all kinds of things on top of it, and it will still hold.
Right. And then also just being curious, right? All the time staying curious about what the other side is feeling, what they're wanting, what their interests are, because those interests over time may change. And so it behooves you to know what those changes are so that you can leverage that in other negotiations with them, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, this has been a fabulous conversation, Kira. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. And if anyone wants to learn more about you, your information will be in the show notes, but I'd love to know, how can they get in touch with you or find you?
Absolutely. So I mentioned earlier, I lead a company called l.informed.now, and our work there is very synonymous with my life's work, and so that's a great way to discover what I'm up to, what my mission, what mission I'm on these days. I'm also very friendly on LinkedIn. I am proudly the only Kira Shishkin in the world, so I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn or any other socials. And if anything that I mentioned or the mission that I'm on with l.informed.now resonates, I would be delighted to be in touch and hear from you.
Thank you so much, Kira, and thank you, listeners, for being with us again on another episode of Negotiation with Alice. Until next time.